Hello, my name is Adolfho Romero. Today is May 26, 2023. Today, I'm here with my colleague, Helio Alves, and we are here on behalf of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. This interview will be part of the SPOP's Farmworkers and Boycotts collection. And today, who do we have the pleasure to interview?
Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Wood. I'm dialing in from Raleigh, North Carolina, where I currently reside. And I was the National Boycott Director for the latter part of the Mount Olive pickle boycott back in the early 2000s.
Well, thank you, Mr. Wood, for making time today. It's so exciting. Thank you for your work that you've done over the years. Right now, we're almost hitting the 20 years in the making of victories from your end. But before we jump into those victories, I know there had to be a lot of challenges to reach those goals that you did. But before I begin, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? Who are you? Where were you born? Can you tell me about what was it growing up like for you, and how did it impacted your activism work in today's time?
Sure. So, kind of going back to the beginning, I was born in Providence, Rhode Island. My dad was going through grad school to ultimately become a hydrogeologist, which is how we ended up in the Yakima Valley in eastern Washington state, a place where I think of as I happened to grow up because North Carolina has always been where I've had a connection because my folks are from North Carolina and I've been here more than half my life. But growing up in eastern Washington, a very conservative area, though there was pro-union sentiment. There were two major economic industries. One was government contracting for nuclear waste cleanup because the area became a population center solely because of the Manhattan Project. And so government intervention has been a very big part of that area, and also investing in agriculture, which is the other major industry. And I played baseball. We traveled all over the state, especially summer ball. I played with farm worker kids. They always brought the Rainier cherries that we all got stomach aches off of, but they're the best cherries if you've ever had them. They're incredible out in Washington. So I grew up with very liberal and engaged parents who taught me a lot about the world. And, you know, as kids, different things appeal to us. For me, it was always politics. Starting with a real understanding of the Civil War and trying to understand the racism in this country, as well as kind of where I stood in relation to it as a white man. It's definitely generational wealth that comes down from those eras. But I was very politically aware. I worked on a congressional campaign when I was a senior in high school, was the campaign manager's assistant, and really got involved on the partisan level as a Democrat, but quickly learned that trying to find ways to bring people together across, instead of through ideologies, but around issues, became really clear for me. And I started a debate club and worked on issues like same-sex marriage that I actually succeeded in winning on in the late 90s in Eastern Washington, because I wrote the 10-page research paper, and my opponent relied on some pretty faulty arguments. So to move forward a little bit more, I moved to North Carolina when I was 20 after a couple of years at community college. And very quickly, in a class called The Rhetoric of Social Movements, learned about the farm worker movement. And I thought, whoa, I grew up with this. I had no idea that the Chateau Saint Michel boycott was happening right around the same time. And flash forward, I learned that there was a group called Flock, and my first reaction was, flock of what? Turned out to be the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. And my teacher referred me to them and said, you should go check it out. So I went to a rally for the first year of the Mount Olive pickle boycott, which was called on St. Patrick's Day for one reason or another. So on March 17th, 2000, and I was 21, I was a junior in college, and I decided I want to do this. So I asked around, found out who the staff person was. I think it may have been Paul or Sheila that referred me to them and said, hey, I want to work for you. And they happened to be looking for an intern that summer to work in Raleigh. And so I began what became quite an interesting 20-year plus year road that started with the Mount Olive pickle boycott. So yeah, that kind of brought me to that point and really launched my career as a community organizer, which I had never, that wasn't on any of the career day stuff growing up, but I somehow found it, and Flock opened that door.
Okay, can you expand a little bit about what is the Mount Olive pickle boycott, and what was it for exactly? And yeah, how did you approach those issues, and how was that fight? Yeah.
Well, it was approached on a very strategic and systemic way of looking at the agriculture industry, and it taught me very early on about how do we look at systems and how do we look at who can make what happen. And so Flock had been around for, 30-something years. Valdemar Velasquez, president of Flock, founded the union when he was 19 after growing up a farm worker. And as they organized, they quickly realized that the growers didn't really have the power that set the conditions. Though they did set the conditions, they didn't have the power to really change how things were if the entire industry wasn't looked at as a whole. And this led to the Campbell boycott that lasted for, you probably learned about this, for 7 or 8 years in the early 80s. And this is where the idea of multi-party collective bargaining was dreamed up by Flock. And so the idea was, well, let's get these companies to the table. They can help get these farmers to the table. The union will be at the table. And let's come to an agreement that may involve raising the price of the crop, or may involve some step of responsibility taken by the company. And let's find a way to get together and do this, because this is the only way we're really going to be able to affect change directly. And so Flock moved to North Carolina, the two biggest pickle cucumber growing states, incidentally for your trivia, are Ohio and North Carolina, and began some initial organizing in the mid-90s. And after some research, it became very clear that the Mount Olive Pickle Company was the biggest game in town. And they were the one major pickle company that wasn't already under contract in Ohio. Vlasic, Dean's Foods, some of these others already were. And so the company was approached in 1997, and this is prehistory for me. I started in 2000, as I said, on the 1-year anniversary of the boycott. There were a lot of talks, there was marches, there was media, the Catholic diocese came out, and everybody on that level said, Mount Olive, as an industry leader, you've got a responsibility for this, and we want to give you the opportunity to come meet with us and see what we can do to resolve these devastating issues in the fields of North Carolina, where workers are dying of heat stroke and paid less than minimum wage and living the most substandard, awful conditions that you can imagine. We used to bring in church groups and build relationships with those farm workers, and everybody walked away saying, how do people live in this? And it's like, how can we work together to find the resources to systemically improve this? And so that was kind of how the boycott came about, because Mount Olive didn't feel the same way. And they pushed off and pushed off and pushed off this dialogue. And so it became necessary to raise the level of intensity and call the boycott. So it had been going very strongly, and there was some initial victories. Kroger grocery store had pulled the pickles off 100 and something stores. The faith community was really picking up the cause, and we were in the midst of a long-standing, expound more on this later, asked me about the important role of the United Methodist Church and ultimately getting this to resolution. So that was kind of the framework for the boycott. I can talk a little bit about, well, why don't we go to the next question, and I can tell you more about whatever you're interested in hearing more about as I take a sip of coffee.
Okay. So what motivates you to, as a boycott leader today, and what are the key principles or values that guide you and your work as a boycott leader?
Well, I think the first thing was that, I had the ability and the time to be out in the community. But I was there representing workers who were out in the fields and who were the most directly impacted by these issues, and being really cognizant. And I still don't even know quite how I feel about it as a white man, doing this work. But I think kind of what I learned, and part of the strategy was privileges can be used to increase equity and improve equity. And I did my best to use that privilege in a positive way, and getting in the halls of these universities and these churches, and being out, talking to all audiences about this important issue. So you're looking for, why don't you repeat the question? This one's hard for me. Once we start talking about values, I'm more of a strategy, tactics, win, campaign sort of person. One other thing I'll just say, and then I'll stop again, is I took a social movement sociology class,
Mm-hmm.
and the professor, I remember his name, but I won't say it. He'd been around. He had a formula for what social movements were. And I excitedly told him I'd been hired to work on this boycott. He was like, "Oh, I know about that. That'll never work." And it was good because it prepared me for a lot of the narrative that we would get from people we wanted to be allies, who should have been allies based on their values on other issues.
Yeah.
They said, "You're never going to win. You're talking about immigrants. You're talking about people of color. You're talking about the South. You're talking about North Carolina, the least unionized state. I bet you don't have any resources. This is a union coming in from the North, and this company doesn't even employ those workers. You're absolutely insane. That'll never work." And so I kind of said, "Yeah, it will." And it's really driven me to be like, no matter what people tell you can't do, you're not going to succeed all the time. And it may take years, decades, but you got to try, because people's minds do change. And when you flesh out what's really happening, especially when people who are impacted can tell that story, it's very powerful, and you'd be surprised. So those are kind of two little things. Why don't we go back to ask your question again, and I'll see if I can answer it.
Okay. Quick question. Yes.
Yes.
I noticed that you talked about strategies, which is you're more strategical, like with whatever was happening during the boycott. Can you tell us or share some of those tactics that were employed to generate public awareness to support the boycotts? And who were the leaders behind this, or the people in charge? You were one of those individuals. Who was behind you, and what were the roles? How did this all come together?
So there was so many people who contributed to this campaign, and I'll start by saying some of them were staff, some of them weren't staff. They were volunteers. And one of the strengths of the farm worker movement, and I think Flock in general, is kind of connecting on that broader moral framework with the faith community about why this is the right thing to do and we must do it. And so champions would be developed just out of the community as the union was visible. And so I'll start with Joanne Price, because Joanne has since passed. she was 80, but I think she turned 80 during the Mount Olive boycott. And she was one of the first people to welcome the United Farm Workers even way back in the 60s or 70s to North Carolina, and was just poised for a campaign like the Mount Olive pickle boycott. And Joanne was the master creator, and she helped, along with Paul Ortiz and Sheila Payne, form a support committee, which I'll get back to. But we had a streak, at least in Durham, and we did these in 20, 25 places. We'd go out leafleting, just in front of grocery stores, usually a Kroger, but all of them. And we're responsible for a lot of the no solicitation or distribution of literature signs at all the major shopping centers. I'd like to think we played a part in that, but we were out every week talking to the general public. And sometimes we would get media attention, other times we would get the attention of managers. And Joanne, especially, I remember, she would always lead our delegation. We'd always have a delegation go into the store to meet with the manager, and then we would set up outside to buy us more time. I was proud to say we only got thrown off property before we were done, only one time. But that was a really base tactic, and we did it every week. I remember even when it snowed, which is rare for here, and people kind of go a little nuts. We called it freezing for a reason and brought out hot chocolate and coffee for everybody and donuts, and we continued our streak. And this could happen on a day of action where people would be out in front of stores in 20 cities. Because what we focused on was, how can we, as a low resource organization, I think we at most had 3 boycott organizers at our height of it. How can we build these committees of concerned people and get them working together in order to support the boycott, to the point where I'm on the support staff? And so these support committees could hold these actions. And we would try to talk to unions. If there was a Jobs with Justice, which is, for those who don't know, a nationwide union community coalition of which there's many chapters. The faith community, college campuses. Really, we would talk to any group that leaned anywhere near progressive that we might want to support us. And we would recruit people from those groups to kind of represent those interests in support of the boycott. There was actually 3 organizers with a group called Democracy North Carolina that worked on campaign finance reform, but they wanted to support us. And one of them was at every single Durham event we did for those 4 years of that. And so the support committees really did a lot of the work. There was really strong ones in Cincinnati. There was a good one in Miami. Jobs with Justice has handled the local actions in other places. So that was one major tactic that we used, was just regular visibility. And this also got the store managers calling up the line and saying, hey, we've got these crazy people out in front of our store again. It's making us look bad. Can somebody call them out on the pickle company and tell them to deal with this? So that was a big part of what we did. Another major thing we did was just symbolic endorsements. It's amazing the power that organizations can have just by signing their name and saying, hey, we support this boycott. We think you should come to the table company and end this so that we can improve things for farm workers. And this is really important to our organization for whatever reason it is, whether it's grounded in faith, whether it's a belief in unions, whether it's college students. We've got a long story about that, but kind of got sucked into it through this endorsement process. And as the boycott, I mean, we had hundreds of organizations endorse our campaign over the years. And it gradually escalated to the point that the National Council of Churches endorsed the boycott. And the biggie was the United Methodist Church. And the United Methodist Church endorsement both preceded my preceded my tenure with Flock in 2000 and came to a resolution right at the end of my tenure at Flock in 2004. And so the CEO of Mount Olive Pickle, a man named Bill Bryan, really good guy. We actually kind of like, I liked him. He was wrong. And ultimately, he kind of was like, well, gosh, we should have just talked earlier. We're like, exactly. Well, he's a devout United Methodist. And the North Carolina Conference was a very powerful conference within the United Methodist Church. And that internationally, they're organized as a general conference. So Flock very early set out and said, well, starting from a very local level at a small church in North Carolina, moving up the line and said, we want this endorsement. And when I started, it was at the point where they had kind of said, well, we're going to appoint a mediator and we want them to help Mount Olive and Flock settle their differences. And it was like, well, whichever side doesn't cooperate, we're going to go on their side. And so, of course, Flock was like, of course we want to talk. This is what we've been asking for. And Mount Olive did not, for whatever reason. But this did not solve the problem in terms of the endorsement, because for whatever reason, this never happened. It got taken off the table. We had multiple delegations from the church come to North Carolina. I got to be a tour guide for them. And then what happened, as I said, we kind of got dragged into something, is Duke University in Durham, incredible university, very powerful institution, is also affiliated with the United Methodist Church. Mm-hmm. And so what happened is kind of in parallel, Flock and the National Farm Worker Ministry, which is very important, asked me about the role of the ministry. Make sure and do that. We were working on the United Methodist Church kind of in a tunnel vision, trying to get to General Conference. At the same time, without us really even knowing about it, United Students Against Sweatshops chapter at Duke University had established an international code of conduct for anything that the university bought. And they learned about the boycott. I think a couple of them came to one of our leafletings, which was also a way to recruit supporters by doing those regularly. They were fun. People came in. It gave us a way for volunteers to get involved, which was so important given our limited financial resources and staff. So they went to university administration, and all of a sudden, the university administration said, well, you're right. Let's pull these $3,000 worth of pickles off the university store shelves. And so then we get called into it because the company objected, of course, like this is one bit. And the university already had some questions, which I still remember this, spending an all-nighter working on this. We called it the Duke document. And it was just like ridiculous documentation of all the things we'd been saying, because they had all these questions. And we presented this to the administration, and then they kind of stonewalled a little bit. And then they came out again and reaffirmed their support of the boycott. So we were like, we won. This is great. Well, flash forward a little bit, and we're getting back to the timing of the school year, and the students aren't hearing anything from administration. And they're like, something's wrong here, clearly. So it was like, well, we just got to wait. And I'm like driving in the middle of the Appalachian foothills to Roanoke, Virginia, because we built not just in North Carolina, we built support committees in other states. And I get a call from the AP, right as I'm like going to go drive through 40 miles of Windy Mountain. He's like, did you hear that Duke University has made a deal with Mount Olive and they're withdrawing their support of the boycott? And I said, what? and then my phone goes into a dead zone and I have to call back. And so I'm pretty proud of this. I called it the Duke Mount Olive Alliance to Save the Farm Workers. And Duke Mount Olive Alliance actually got into as a headline for one of the papers. I forget which one. But all of a sudden we had a controversy with Duke University where there was both issues with process, leaving the students out of this, because what they did is they came up with a deal where Mount Olive would get their farmers to sign pieces of paper affirming they followed the law, and Duke on 24 hours notice could say, we want to see those papers. And then they agreed that they were going to somehow work together to improve policy on the state level for farm workers, which hasn't improved. So I don't know what happened with that. And that was enough. And so this led to further engagement with Duke. And then these two things came together. And so then the United Methodist endorsement was like, well, we'll see what Duke does. And we're going to watch that. And so what happened is we did marches, we did a house meeting campaign. This is where I got trained on house meeting campaigns. Just as an organizer, this is a great school to learn how to do everything. And we ended up with 400 people on a rainy Thursday morning on Duke's West Campus, which is really hard to find parking on. So it was even more impressive. And Duke got brought into this endorsement process, and their administrator more or less called me a liar and blamed it on going to Chapel Hill. And another person told Leticia, who's really important, that they did charity and that was fine, and it was awful, and they made jerks of themselves. So flash forward, and I'm going to get back to key figures, I promise. I know I've gone off on a tangent. So ultimately we get up, and because we exposed enough of how bad this deal was, because it was the students. So I'll get back on point to that question here. So there's a student at Duke named Jillian Johnson, who's now a city councilwoman in Durham and nationally recognized for her work on the local government. She was the United Student Singing Sweatshops leader and kind of my contact person, though they met at 3 a.m. It was wild. I was 21, 22, so it was fine. And so me and Lori Kamala, who's another really important player in this from the National Farm Worker Ministry, and Jillian, this is right after the Iraq War started too. So it was just wild times. And we were really involved with that too, in North Carolina labor against the war, but that's another story. So we're driving up to DC because we want to let the United Methodists know that the Duke students didn't agree with what administration did. So we had all these testimonials from Duke students written out, because they'd been out over the summer to meet workers and see conditions for themselves. And we actually pulled over in Richmond to use their wireless, because they had it way back then, to send these testimonies up to Reverend Michael Spock, who's another really important character, who's a United Methodist minister who worked for the AFL-CIO. And got them up to him so he could present to the group. And then Jillian, actually, we got to DC. It was this fancy hotel near Dulles Airport. This is very vivid. Jillian came in and convinced them that there were still issues and they needed to reconsider pulling their endorsement or not endorsing the boycott. They agreed. And we went through this whole process. It included me driving up to DC to have a 15-minute conversation with a bishop that flipped the tie, getting to the general conference, getting through tricks and procedural items where they tried to bump us up before we were ready for no reason at all. And a random conversation I had with a minister from Texas stopped it, because he just got up and said, "Why are we changing this around? We should just do this as we had planned." And we got to the floor. We knew if we got to the floor, we'd win, because the international congregations were almost all going to vote for us, and we'd split the vote with the US ones. So May 2004, after something that predated 2000. The United Methodist Church endorsed the Mount Olive pickle boycott, and there was a contract within 4 months. There were a lot of things that happened. I think Legal Aid was suing the crap out of the North Carolina Growers Association as well. So there were a lot of things that pulled this together, but that tactic and all those really incredible people made that happen, and it played a major role. So hopefully not too much of a tangent. If you want to get me back on track, go ahead. And I do have to finish about Joanne Price too.
Okay.
But,
Okay. So, can I ask Adolfo, or would you like to ask something?
No, I mean, well, I'll just ask more of a commentary here. It's really interesting to see the church, the role of the church itself, from the
Yes.
United Methodist Church, from Farmworkers Ministry, all of these agents coming together collectively. I'm thinking here, we have within the civil rights movement, we also have the power within the Black community through the Black church. And these are central hubs, community collective central hubs. For folks that are able to work together collectively in this for big boycotts. What I wanted to say, like, how have you seen the changes, I guess, from that time, early 2000s to now? What role is it still as powerful as it once was, or is it building again, gaining momentum, or did we go through a stagnant time frame in between, or where do you see things play out from that time back in the early 2000s to now?
So one thing I'll say is my journey has taken me out of the labor movement, and my deep knowledge of what's happening in the labor movement is 10 years atrophied. But what I do know, and what I think is changing, especially with the United Service, I'm going to get it wrong, the United Service Workers Union. It started as Fight for 15, Raise Up for 15 here with fast food workers, and is now gone to a broader low-wage worker movement. And they've used similar tactics in terms of reaching out to the faith community, as well as students and others that I think of as constituencies of conscience. And they do it really well, and I've been really impressed to see that kept up. And I think one of the things that Flock did is just drew a line in the sand and said, we're not going until this is done. They have done the same thing and made the commitment, and it's worked really well. Another important campaign that used similar tactics to Flock was in the mid to late 2000s, the Justice of Smithfield campaign. And they very much learned from Flock, and I worked on that too, in terms of how do we bring the faith community in support of the labor program, because in the South, you've got to make a commitment to the community. You've got to recognize that workers are the community, and then there's a broader community with that support. And you got to draw a line in the sand, and you can win in the South. But unless you do that, and I would say I haven't seen a lot of that. I think these new movements that are happening, like Starbucks and REI, I know there was an REI picket line. They had fired a union supporter, and they went on strike, unfair labor practice strike, and the community came out to support them, and they won. The worker got reinstated, and they came up with some more fair election conditions. So I do think some of it's happening, but I don't think it's happening on the scale that it should, and I don't think it's the traditional unions that are leading that charge, and I think that's a big mistake, because I think if a small farm worker union of immigrants can do something like this, and 7,000 workers were impacted by the Mount Olive pickle boycott, and the Smithfield campaign was 6,000 workers. It was an incredible, smashing success. I'd love to see more of that. And I think more victories could be won, and we could change some of the character of what it looks like in North Carolina labor. But there haven't been those resource investments, which I would love to see more of.
Okay. Okay. I was gonna ask initially, thinking about the task of organizing and mobilizing people. I was gonna ask what are the challenges that you have faced, but now I am really interested in hearing about how are the challenges changing? How have the challenges changed in the past 20 years from your perspective? And also, how do you envision the future of boycott movements and their potential of creating social change?
Mm-hmm. Could you repeat that one more time? I'm going to take notes.
The first question, the first part?
Yeah. So
Okay.
we got challenges.
Yeah, about the challenges. How have the challenges changed in the past 20 years?
Mm-hmm.
Looking back, and and the second part is how do you envision the future of boycott movements and their potential of social change?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the world in the last, it's funny, as you get older and more experienced, but the world seems so much bigger now than it did 20 years ago. Like with the Mount Olive campaign, I mean, one of the biggest challenges is just how do you keep people engaged over a 4 or 5 year campaign? How do you keep coming up with something new? How do you keep that hope going? But I really felt like what we did is we really concentrated in the one-on-one organizing through building these support committees and also kind of using these different strategies that were very doable where a handful of people could make a big difference. I feel like, and this is something that I've kind of stayed away from, is the social media aspect of how that interacts with campaigns, because on one hand, it broadens your reach and you can reach thousands instead of hundreds. Like, we could pull out 200 or 300 people to a boycott event, and that was huge. And that was a 6-week event. And now we can get out to so many more people. I mean, we were barely even using email. It was phone calls. It was in-person coffee. It was going to church with people. And I think that made it easier to help people stay in for the long haul. And it made it easier as an organizer to keep my sanity, though I lost it on multiple occasions because I really didn't know what I was doing. But who does until they do it, I suppose. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges. I think also the politics has shifted even further towards corporate power. I mean, the Mount Olive boycott was before corporations were people. And the incredible influence of political spending has been exacerbated. And, but that's one thing about corporations. Corporations aren't politics. They're authoritarian institutions that care about their image, which is, and I only see this looking forward as becoming more. And I worry about that because I think part of what keeps these long campaigns going is that commitment and that belief and those relationships and bonds between the people who know each other, who are working on these campaigns. And I see less and less of that, and more of the focus towards more shallow engagement of a lot of people rather than deeper engagement of fewer people.
Yeah.
But because of the importance of social media, I don't think you can win campaigns without it. You've got to have it. But at the same time, what does that mean for people doing things in real time and real action? I think boycott campaigns are going to be even harder to win. I think the discourse has shifted, and I hear outside of what's happening, and maybe we're seeing a resurgence. I really hope we are, and it seems like it. And like I said, I haven't been as close as an observer, but I think it's going to be harder because it's so much bigger and you need so much more people. But I also think the victories can be more decisive because everything is about matters of degree and how do you build echo chambers and how does things work throughout the industry. And I think there's a lot more interconnectedness. And so the power of the victories could be even greater. But I think the old tactics still work and they're needed. I think it's a both and rather than an either or. But the question is, where do the resources get put? And organizing is always the first thing that's cut when it comes to a lot of kind of the broader paid justice world anyway, which is another interesting, I think, I feel like that's another thing that has changed and is both a challenge and helpful. But it was individual people that were connected with organizations, but these were volunteers. A lot of them that made this happen, and I think it's harder to get now. And it's also kind of the interesting. How do you think about valuing people's time and commitment, which is something that if you were a supporter, we didn't really think about that. You've got to think about that now, rightfully so.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Mr. Wood, I know we're going on time. We have about 5-6 more minutes left, but you're making me think a lot about all this, which is a really good thing. Even in regards to thinking about long-term campaigns and what it means, and how, today's time we are using a lot of our social media, but at the same time, is it the most effective tool? From what I'm getting the impression here is like you still need that one-on-one individual connection with the individual, be collective in your community, be participant like at one-on-one. And it's to create that bond, create that formal bond, like it brings you closer together. So that's a really good point that you're bringing. What I wanted to ask you before we conclude our interview is, if you had a message to tell to the next generation that are probably going to be watching this video, what message would you convey to them? What message would you convey that would focus perhaps on how to get involved, or what is their civic duty? Is it a civic duty? What should they be focusing on? What should they do if there's a message that you could convey?
Well, I think my story is instructive. Show up at a rally and ask for a job. See what happens. For college students, find out the organizations that interest you most on campus and get involved. It's a great way. Intern with organizations if you can. I think the challenge is going to be the student debt crisis. I kind of just missed that, which makes it more difficult. I think just the same thing, my response to the professor who told me it wasn't possible. It is. But you got to be smart about it, and you got to be committed. You got to have some luck. But it's there if you make it. And yeah, it is the right thing to do, but I also understand people need to make a living and they can't make it their whole life. And I think that's one thing that is a challenge to the movement, is some people are able to throw their whole selves at it. Others really can't. They can't afford to. And it's like, as an organizer, a lot of times groups will try to do things one size fits all. Oh, we need you to do this one phone bank for us. Whereas I'm talking to somebody and I'm like, well, what are you good at? What do you like to do? oh, you like social media, you like photography, you like, oh, we need that. Could you do that? And to find ways where you fit in and where you can like use the skills you have and maximize the impact you have, and also limit the stress, because volunteering is stressful because people's lives are already very full. And so how do you create access points where people can bring their strengths to it and be able to contribute on their terms? And how do you cast your net broad enough so that you have enough people to do the work even? And one thing, and I probably have a couple minutes after 10:30, but people do this work because they like the other people that are in the work. That's how people are going to keep showing up, is if you have those bonds. And so any operation that I do as an organizer, it starts with the committee. And it's like, how do you have a committed group? And it could be as few as 5 or 10 people, but you need people with melding skill sets who like each other. And you need enough people, and you need it rolling enough, in the sense that we're not having co-chairs and terms and whatever. It's who's on the committee. Because what that allows for is people to go on and off the committee as their lives ebb and flow, and the committee continuing to keep going. And also an opportunity for any new person, hey, join the committee. And that's something, and it's amazing what can work if you maximize people's time and you create a space where people want to be and they look forward to, and there's some regularity. And I've used that and kind of the coalition model that Flock used ever since, and have founded several coalitions that still exist. And all of that was kind of figuring out what's our collective self-interest, and from what perspective is someone coming to an issue. And I learned that with Flock, because there were people who supported us because they supported farmers, because they understood that this was about improving things for farmers too, because this was about changing a system that they certainly didn't benefit as much from either. Or talking about students, about how this doesn't fit into the code of conduct, or talking to unions about this is about organizing the South, or talking to anybody about anything. It's like, how do you find what argument is going to appeal and what brings them to this? Because it's not like a media campaign where you want to be on message. There's a ton of reasons why different constituencies would come together to support the same thing, but for different reasons. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a matter of coming together for the end goal of working together. And I've taken that with me ever since, and still use it as I work across the aisle on many issues, including those related to food and agriculture.
Excellent. Okay, I know we're already at 10:31. Helio, do you have any last questions, or are we good?
No, I'm good.
Okay, any last comments, Mr. Wood, that you would like to leave behind, or you're good for now, or how do you?
Yeah, let's leave it at that for now.
Excellent.
But I'm glad to have a follow-up conversation,
Absolutely.
because there's plenty more.
Absolutely.
Not all the boycott stories and people, but I think I gave you a pretty good sampling, I hope, at least.
Okay, I'm going to conclude this interview, and I'll stop this recording now.